Welcome to the YouTube channel for my new book, Seed of Israel, DNA Guide to Tracing Your Jewish Ancestry, available on Amazon in eBook and paperback versions. There are links to order your copy below, and be sure to hit that subscribe button to see more videos like this on the Seed of Israel YouTube channel. In the second video, I want to provide more information from the end of the first video on the earliest Jews in Europe and possible migration routes to Europe from centers of Jewish antiquity, such as Judea, Babylon, Alexandria, Syria, and other places in the Middle East and the Mediterranean basin. In the next video, the third installment, I'm going to discuss the shared ancestry and genetic similarities between Jews and Samaritans. And I'm also going to talk about the haplogroups of Ashkenazi Jews on the Y-DNA and mtDNA side and discuss some of their possible origins. Are they from the Middle East? Are they from Europe? Where are they from? Okay, the earliest Jews in Europe. In order to understand the Jews in Europe, we have to go back in time to the Hellenistic era and the Roman period, and the spread of Jewish communities from their ancestral homeland of Judea across the Mediterranean basin. I highly recommend reading the book Jews in the Mediterranean Diaspora, From Alexander to Trajan, 323 BCE to 117 CE, by John M.G. Barclay, for a comprehensive review of the 440-year period when Jewish communities developed in Egypt, Syria, Cyrenaica, which is modern-day Libya, Rome, and Asia. Now I'm going to read an excerpt from the book Jewish People, Jewish Thought, The Jewish Experience in History, by Robert M. Seltzer, which provides an excellent summary of the Jewish diaspora during the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Before I get to this passage from the book that I want to read, I want to briefly go over the Rhineland theory of Ashkenazi Jews, which is mentioned in my book, Seed of Israel. It's basically Roman Jews who were either taken as slaves during the Roman-Jewish Wars or voluntarily migrated to Rome as merchants and traders in the Mediterranean diaspora. These Roman Jews became the Italcum Jews, or Italcim, which is Italian for Jews, basically. It's the Italian Jews. These Italian Jews settled in Rome and Lucca, and then in the early medieval period, migrated to Rome, Mainz, Worms, and Speyer in the Rhineland. These Italian Jews joined French Jews, already existing French Jewish communities, who had followed the Roman legions to garrison towns in Gaul, which is modern-day France. And these French Jews and these Italian Jews, they joined the existing Rhineland Jews, who, like the French Jews, had followed the Roman legions north to Garmadia and Gaul. A famous family of Italian Jews who played a pivotal role in developing the Ashkenazim in Germany was the Kalonymos family of Lucca, Italy, who originated in Jerusalem. And in a later video installment, I would like to go into the history of the Kalonymos family and of Judea and later of Lucca, and how pivotal a role they played in the development of the Ashkenazim. Here's the passage from the book Jewish People, Jewish Thought, The Jewish Experience in History, by Robert M. Seltzer. The first permanent Jewish diaspora was a settlement in Babylon created by Nebuchadnezzar's deportations from Judah in the 590s to 580s BCE, The Israelites exiled by the Assyrians in the 720s BCE did not long survive as a separate group. Although the Babylonian Jews returned to Jerusalem in several waves during the Persian period, a sizable Jewish population continued to reside in Mesopotamia and played an influential role in Jewish intellectual history beginning the 3rd century CE. In Egypt, Jewish settlements were established by Jewish soldier contingents brought there by the Persians. These exilic and post-exilic communities were a modest prelude to the remarkable expansion in the numbers and distribution of diaspora Jews that occurred in the Hellenistic era. Diasporas, this is very interesting because the Jews were not the only diaspora in this period. It's a very important point here. Diasporas were a common feature of the Hellenistic Roman world. In the 4th century BCE, colonies of Egyptian, Syrian, and Phoenician merchants were frequently in the seaports of Greece and Italy. After the conquest of Alexander the Great, Greeks and Macedonians constituted an immense diaspora throughout the Near East. Ethnic resettlement and religious diffusion went hand in hand, as settlers brought with them ancestral cults and won for their gods new worshippers among the local population. Although not unique, the Jewish diaspora was outstanding in its ability to preserve and perpetuate its identity at considerable distance from the homeland and over large stretches of time. So very important to understand there were many other diasporas at that time, especially in the Hellenistic period, but the Jewish diaspora was one of the few that was really strong in their identity, and that continues to this day in the modern day Jewish diaspora. This is about Egypt and the Jewish diaspora in Egypt. Several factors guided the spread of the Jewish dispersions in Hellenistic times, of which the political history of the Mediterranean basin was the most important. During Ptolemaic rule of Judea, large-scale Jewish settlement in Egypt began. Under the first Ptolemies, Jewish captives, when freed, established communities throughout the country. The Ptolemies brought in Jewish soldiers and their families, and other Jews migrated from Judea and Egypt, probably for economic reasons. At its height, Egyptian Jewry in Hellenistic times was highly diversified. There were peasants and shepherds, Jewish generals in the Ptolemaic army, and Jewish officials in the civil service and the police. At Leontopolis, an Aaronite priest from Jerusalem founded a small temple with a sacrificial cult modeled on that of Jerusalem. And this is in parentheses. The shrine survived for over 2 centuries until just after 70 CE, but it does not seem to have been an important place of worship for Egyptian Jewry as a whole. Alexandria, the capital of the Ptolemies and the intellectual center of Hellenistic civilization, became one of the most populous Jewish communities in the world between the 3rd century BCE and the end of the 1st century CE, numbering several hundred thousand at least. Alexandria Jewry included wealthy merchants, bankers, and shippers at one end of the social spectrum, and masses of Jewish artisans and shopkeepers at the other. The Ptolemies also founded Jewish colonies in the city of Cyrenaica, which again is modern-day Libya. And then it goes to say the Falashas, or exiles in Amharic, if I'm saying that correctly, or the Black Jews of Ethiopia, who refer to themselves as Beta Israel, House of Israel, may stem from Egyptian Jewish contacts during Hellenistic and Roman times. So I do want to get into more of the history of the Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jews, which is really shrouded in mystery, but this is one possible theory for their origins. Asia Minor and other northern settlements. The northern diaspora arose when the Seleucids took control of Judea after 200 CE. Around 210 to 205, the Seleucid king Antiochus III moved several thousand Jewish soldiers and their families from Babylonia to Asia Minor. Within 2 centuries, large Jewish communities were to be found in Antioch and Damascus, in the Phoenician ports, and in the Asia Minor cities of Sardis, Halicarnassus, Pergamum, and Ephesus. By the turn of the Common Era, Jews lived on most of the islands of the Eastern Mediterranean, such as Cyprus and Crete, in mainland Greece and Macedonia, on the shores of the Black Sea, and in the Balkans. Jewish inscriptions from the early centuries CE have been found in the Crimea and in modern Romania and Hungary. Rome and other Western settlements. When the Roman presence was felt in the Near East, the growth of Jewish settlement further west ensued. By the mid-1st century BCE, the Roman statesman Cicero, in his speech in defense of Flaccus, insinuates the Jews were a troublesome element among the Roman masses. Large masses of Jews were brought to Rome as slaves by Roman generals campaigning in Judea. Ransomed by other Jews and augmented by a steady stream of voluntary migrants, they swelled the Roman Jewish community, despite occasional government efforts, on one pretext or another, to reduce their numbers. According to satirical remarks in the Roman poets, most Roman Jews were poor and some were beggars. But there were Jewish storekeepers, craftsmen, and actors in Rome, and visiting Jewish diplomats, merchants, and scholars. And this is important. This is somewhat similar to the Jewish community in Alexandria. So it's important to know that there was a diversity of occupations and lifestyles of the Jews in these centers of antiquity, such as Rome and Alexandria. Not all of them were slaves, or not all of them were merchants and traders. Some were involved in creative professions as well, or politics or diplomacy. In the later Roman Empire, cities in southern Italy became important Jewish centers, and large settlements appeared in western North Africa and Spain. Jewish groups were found in Gaul, which again is modern-day France, and in the Roman garrison towns on the Rhine. A remark attributed to the Greek geographer Strabo, partly true in his time, in the 1st century BCE, was certainly characteristic of the Roman Empire at its height. Quote, "This people has already made its way into every city, and it is not easy to find any place in the habitable world which has not received the nation and in which it has not made its power felt." It's from Josephus' excerpt from Antiquities. So now I want to read a brief history of the Jewish diaspora in antiquity, which provides some more context to the origins of European Jewry, and it's somewhat similar to the passages I've just been reading, but this one focuses a little bit more on the Greek-Jewish interactions, which I really think is important to understanding the origins of Western Jews, including the Ashkenazis, Sephardim, North African Jews, Italian Jews, and the Romaniot, who are the Greek Jews. And all these Jewish diaspora groups are mentioned in my book, Seed of Israel. The earliest contacts of the ancient Hebrews with Europe and Europeans. Also, I just want to real quick, just to preface this passage, that it really goes into how Europe was so influential in Israel, Eretz Israel. So that's really important to understand. This is going back to antiquity. The earliest contacts of the ancient Hebrews with Europe and Europeans were probably through the Greek traders, who were familiar figures all over the Eastern Mediterranean, littoral, as early as the 8th century BCE. It must, however, be borne in mind that the Hebrews were settled mainly in the uplands of Eretz Israel, away from the coastal area, while the Greeks were at this time almost as much Asiatics as Europeans geographically. It was probably at the time of the first exile, after the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, that Jews first penetrated into Europe. The Hebrew prophets, for instance Isaiah, speak more than once of the future redemption of the Jewish exiles from the, quote, Isles of the Sea, unquote, by which presumably the Greek coastlands were implied. And it is likely enough that at this period, Greek slave dealers purchased Jewish captives for sale on their domestic markets. So not just Jews, the Romans did not just take Jews as slaves, but the Greeks took Jews as slaves as well. Important note. Although their absorption in the Persian Empire confirmed the Asiatic nature of the Jewish people for a long period, that empire's expansionist ambitions westward to some extent opened it and its Jewish population to Western and European ideas and influences. After the return from exile, Greek influences on the trading cities of the Palestinian littoral were becoming strong, and some later books of the Bible, e.g. Ecclesiastes, seem to show a distinct Hellenic coloring. Important point as well that Hellenism even influenced the Bible and the writers of the Hebrew Bible. Let's see. It was, however, the conquest of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE that definitely changed the character of this area. Hitherto, Eretz Israel has been part of the Near Eastern had been part of the Near Eastern Afro-Asiatic nexus, looking to and influenced by Syria, Assyria, and Babylonia to the north, the Arabian tribes to the east, and Egypt to the south. Alexander the Great broke down, as it were, the barrier that had hitherto divided this region from Europe. Henceforth, Eretz Israel looked west, not east, and with the surrounding area was part of the European nexus and sphere of influence, more or less sharply divided from Asia and the Asiatic powers. Insofar as they continued to be affected by the neighboring land areas, it was by those, Syria, Egypt, that had largely succumbed to Greek influences and can now be regarded almost as extensions of Europe. Although great masses of Jews remained under Partho-Persian rule in Mesopotamia, the most important settlement outside of Eretz Israel was in Greek-speaking Alexandria. Important to note that, yes, Alexandria was in Egypt, but it was also a Greek city. It was very much a Hellenistic city, which had constant and intimate contacts with centers of European life. It was here, in fact, in the ensuing period, that Jews produced the greatest Hellenistic literature, reaching its climax in Philo and constituting their first literary expression in the language of European culture. From certain points of view, the Hasmonean revolt in the 2nd century BCE could be considered a reaction against the tendency that has been described, an attempt to stem the inroads of European culture and to reassert Asiatic values. However, its success was only temporary. The Hasmonean monarchs, while asserting political independence, ultimately succumbed to some extent to European cultural influences. The Roman conquest of 63 BCE brought Eretz Israel and its population, still the largest and most creative part of the Jewish people, under European rule and within the European cultural orbit. It is hardly an exaggeration to say that from now on, down to the Arab conquest in 640 CE, Eretz Israel and its population constituted in effect part of Europe, and the European influences on the Jewish population there, and hence on Judaism itself, became increasingly strong. So we're talking about the European of antiquity, which is obviously very different than the later Europe, had a strong influence. Talking about the Greeks and the Romans had a very strong influence in Eretz Israel, in Israel. So that's very important to understand. This predated Ashkenazim by many, many, many years. Meanwhile, the actual Jewish settlement in Europe was growing. From the 3rd century BCE, Jews were mentioned in inscriptions, etc., on the mainland of Greece. The early Hasmonean rulers had entered into diplomatic relations with Rome, necessitating the dispatch of envoys thither. And there is a somewhat obscure reference to the expulsion of Jewish religious propagandists thence in 139 BCE. Thereafter, the wars of the Romans in Asia Minor and their conquest of Eretz Israel inevitably resulted in the arrival on the Roman slave market of Jewish captives, many of whom would win their freedom or else be ransomed by their co-religionists. While the capital of the empire inevitably attracted visitors, emissaries, and merchants, rabbinic sources, the New Testament, or as Jews would call it, the Christian Testament, and Josephus, who was a Roman Jewish historian of antiquity, all confirm the impression of a solid Jewish community there in the 1st century CE, the subsequent importance of which is attested by several series of catacombs and hundreds of inscriptions. As early as 59 BCE, Cicero, in his oration in defense of Flaccus, who had raided the Jewish temple offerings in the Greek islands, could assert that the Jews were present at the trial in Rome of such numbers as to overawe the court. Jews were also present in this period in many other places throughout Italy, especially along the trade routes leading to the ports commanding trade to the east. The existence of Jewish settlements all over the Roman Empire in its heyday is recorded in Gaul, which is France, Spain, Pannonia, which I believe is Hungary, modern-day Hungary, and even in the Rhineland, which is modern-day Germany. It is probable that there was no Roman province without a Jewish settlement, even if no definite evidence is preserved. The total number involved was far from insignificant. The Jewish population of Rome had been estimated, with some exaggeration, at as many as 50,000. And it has been asserted that they constituted something like 1/10 of the population of the empire as a whole. The Jews of Europe, by the time of the breakup of the Roman Empire, were probably to be reckoned at some hundreds of thousands. On the other hand, their cultural significance was slight. They made barely the slightest contribution to rabbinic or Hebrew culture in the Talmudic age, nor is any work of this period extant in Latin, which is certainly of Jewish authorship. So there is ample evidence. So that's the passage. And I just want to add that, so, basically what we've read so far, and I'm about to read one more passage towards the end of the video, but what we're basically, there is really ample evidence of the Middle Eastern origins. And this goes beyond just genetics and DNA, which I really, my book is, a lot of it is about, of the Middle Eastern origins of the Ashkenazi and earliest Jewish communities in Europe. Jews either came from Judea or Babylon or Syria or Alexandria, as well as other Jewish centers of antiquity in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean. So I want to end with this passage from the book, A History Atlas of the Jewish People by Eli Barnavi. The history of the beginnings of a Jewish presence in Europe cannot be thought of as a linear and continuous development. The evidence is fragmentary, random, and often inconsistent. The earliest recorded presence of Jews in medieval Europe is that of colonies of Oriental or Syrian merchants in towns north of the Loire, that's spelled O-L-O-I-R-E, or in southern Gaul, again, modern-day France, during the 5th and 6th centuries. In the historians' debate concerning the demarcation of periods, the existence of these colonies attests to the persistence of trade in the period of transition from the urban and Mediterranean world of late antiquity to the Middle Ages. It also indicates the contraction of commerce, which was then limited solely to the import of luxury goods and carried out almost exclusively by non-indigenous groups, which inherited the role of the Greek-speaking diaspora. After an interruption of over 150 years, we encounter another group of Jewish merchants, new arrivals from the great centers of Jewish civilization in Palestine and Babylon. Obviously, they use the word Palestine. I would not use that word Palestine. I would use the word Eretz Israel, Israel, Judah, Judea. They were attracted to Europe not only by the profit to be made in distant lands, but also by the policy of protection offered by the Carolingian kings, who wished to encourage and control the suppliers of expensive textiles, spices, and other luxury articles consumed by the rich nobility. In the 9th century, some of these merchants were involved in long-distance trade encompassing the whole of Eurasia. From the Frankish kingdom, which was in France, obviously, they exported swords, slaves, and furs to the Muslim world. Then, following the Silk Road to India and China, and returning via Khazaria and the Slavic lands, they brought back spices and perfumes to Europe. A Muslim document refers to these great dealers as Radinia, from the river Rhone or a region near Baghdad. In a future video, I also want to go more into the Radanites, these groups of Jewish traders who were possibly from Babylonia, who played a very influential role in early Jewish history in Europe, the Radanites. From several sources, we learn of the existence of a community of prosperous Jewish merchants protected by imperial agents who enjoyed the social prestige which the Christian society was willing to accord to the descendants of the people in the Bible. When Agobard, the Archbishop of Lyons, conducted an intensive campaign against the Jews, his effort to restrict their activities all failed. It was only after the Carolingian period, however, that the Jewry, destined to be known as Ashkenazi, was formed and began to evolve its unique patterns of internal organization and cultural life. Large families, often led by rabbinical scholars, migrated from southern Europe, particularly from Italy, to establish communities in the Paris Basin and the regions of Champagne and the Rhine. Quite small at first, these communities began to grow rapidly during the 11th century. From about 4,000 persons around the turn of the millennium, the number of Jews in German lands had reached almost 20,000 by the time of the First Crusade, at the end of the 11th century. Now, again, one of those families from Italy were the Kalonymos family, which, again, I'm going to get into in a later video. I also wanted to discuss a genetic bottleneck that occurred in the Middle Ages around the Rhineland, which I believe could have been from the series of crusades, massacres of the Jews along the Rhineland. But I will get into that in a later video. It was only after the Carolingian period, however, that the Jewry destined to be known as, excuse me, almost repeated a paragraph there. So we're just wrapping up the video here. Thank you for watching. These new communities also dealt in a lot of distance trade. The first generation immigrants recognized hereditary monopoly rights and relations with clients, a custom borrowed from Arabic-speaking communities such as that of Karun, and still practiced amongst Ashkenazi Jews as late as the 17th century. The new communities imposed internal discipline to prevent feuds between rival family firms, and while jealously guarding their independence, acceptance an intercommunal system of control and intervention to ensure peaceful relations and harmony within their diaspora. For historians who wish to organize the sporadic and uneven history of European Jewry into a convenient formula of a succession of dominant centers, the late 11th century, the age of Rashi, the great medieval commentator, opens a new chapter. Henceforth, Ashkenazi Jewry would maintain its predominance in the Jewish world. So that's that passage, the final passage I read. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, in the next video, I'm going to get into the shared ancestry and genetic similarities between Samaritans and Jews and go over the Y-DNA and mtDNA. Y-DNA is patrilineal descent, mtDNA is matrilineal descent, the haplogroups in Ashkenazi Jews. So where are these haplogroups from? Are they from the Middle East? Are they from North Africa? Are they from Asia? Are they from Europe? We'll find out in the third installment of the Seed of Israel video series, and thank you for watching.